10:22 hours, June 4, 1942, 220 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey pushed his Douglas SBD Dauntless into a 70-degree dive, the altimeter unwinding from 14,000 feet as the Japanese aircraft carrier Kaga grew larger in his bomb sight. Behind him, 30 more dive bombers followed in sequence, each pilot fighting against gravitational forces that tried to drag consciousness from their minds, each bombardier calculating the precise moment to release 1,000 pounds of high explosive that could change the course of history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scene before them should not have existed. By every reasonable calculation, McCluskey and his squadron should have been halfway back to the USS Enterprise by now, their fuel tanks approaching empty, their mission a failure. The Japanese carriers they had launched to find 2 hours earlier were not where intelligence had predicted. They were not where doctrine suggested they should be. For nearly 40 minutes, McCluskey had flown his air group over empty ocean, watching fuel gauges drop, listening to the growing desperation in radio calls from pilots wondering when their commander would admit defeat and turn for home. But McCluskey had not turned back. He had made a decision that violated training, contradicted logic, and risked the lives of every man under his command. He had continued searching when search seemed futile. He had turned north when south seemed more probable. He had gambled everything on a counterintuitive hunch that the enemy must be somewhere they were not supposed to be. And 20 minutes ago, that gamble had revealed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steaming in formation below, their decks packed with aircraft being armed and fueled for a strike that would destroy the American carriers waiting over the horizon. Now McCluskey and his dive bombers were falling from the sky onto targets that had no fighter protection, no warning, and no chance of escape. In 6 minutes, 3 of those carriers would be burning wrecks. By sunset, all 4 would be heading to the ocean floor. The Battle of Midway would transform from potential American catastrophe into decisive Japanese defeat, and the entire Pacific War would pivot on this single attack made possible by one pilot's refusal to accept failure. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why McCluskey's decision mattered so profoundly, you need to understand what was at stake on that June morning in 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy was fighting for survival in the Pacific. Japan had conquered Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies. Japanese forces had advanced to the doorstep of Australia and India. The Imperial Japanese Navy controlled an oceanic empire stretching across thousands of miles, defended by the most experienced carrier pilots in the world, flying aircraft that dominated every engagement. The American carrier force, the only weapon capable of striking back at Japan's conquests, consisted of exactly 3 operational carriers in the entire Pacific Ocean: the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown. That was the complete inventory. Every other American battleship lay on the bottom of Pearl Harbor or was under repair. Every other carrier was deployed in the Atlantic or under construction in shipyards that would not finish building them for months or years. Japan was coming to Midway with 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Their pilots had trained together for years before the war. Their aircraft had destroyed American, British, and Dutch forces across the Pacific with methodical efficiency. Intelligence estimated that Japanese carrier pilots averaged 800 to 1,000 hours of flight time before entering combat. Many had been flying operationally since the invasion of China in 1937. American carrier pilots in June 1942 averaged perhaps half that experience. Some had received their wings only months earlier. They were flying into combat against an enemy that had perfected carrier warfare through 5 years of continuous operations. The tactical situation was equally grim. American codebreakers had determined that Japan planned to invade Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. The atoll was strategically critical because it sat at the outer edge of America's defensive perimeter. If Japan captured Midway, Japanese bombers could strike Hawaii regularly. Japanese submarines could strangle supply lines between the United States and Australia. The entire defensive position that Admiral Chester Nimitz had been desperately trying to maintain would collapse, potentially forcing the United States to abandon the Central Pacific entirely and retreat to a defensive line along the American west coast. Nimitz had positioned his 3 carriers north of Midway, hoping to ambush the Japanese fleet. But ambush required perfect execution. The American carriers needed to locate the Japanese carriers, launch their aircraft, and destroy the enemy before the Japanese could retaliate. If the Americans missed, if they attacked the wrong targets, or if the Japanese struck first, the United States would lose carriers it could not replace. Japan could afford to trade losses. Japan had 6 more fleet carriers in reserve, with more under construction. America had none. Every American carrier was irreplaceable. Every American pilot was precious. Every aircraft lost represented manufacturing capacity that could not be quickly replenished. The mathematics of attrition favored Japan overwhelmingly, which meant that when McCluskey launched from Enterprise on the morning of June 4th with 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers under his command, he was leading a strike force that represented a substantial portion of America's offensive power in the entire Pacific Ocean. If his mission failed, if he returned to Enterprise without finding the enemy or having expended his bombs on worthless targets, the opportunity to strike would be lost. The Japanese would locate the American carriers and destroy them, but finding the enemy required more than courage or skill. It required the kind of tactical judgment that could not be taught at Pensacola or practiced in training exercises. It required understanding not just where the enemy should be according to doctrine, but where the enemy actually was based on incomplete information, contradictory reports, and intuition built through years of operational experience. Clarence Wade McCluskey possessed that intuition. He had earned it through a career that had taken him from Depression-era training squadrons to command of Enterprise Air Group in the most critical naval battle of the Pacific War. His path to that moment over the Japanese carriers was not the story of a destined hero or a brilliant tactical genius recognized early and promoted rapidly. It was the story of a solid, professional naval aviator who happened to be exactly the right person in exactly the right position when history demanded someone who could make an impossible decision and get it right. McCluskey was born in Buffalo, New York, on June 1, 1902. His father was an accountant, solidly middle class, the kind of family that valued education and stability. Young Wade showed no particular interest in military service initially. He was a good student, athletic, responsible. He received an appointment to the United States Naval Academy and entered Annapolis in 1922, joining a class that would graduate into a Navy undergoing profound transformation. The Naval Academy in the 1920s was teaching cadets to fight the last war. Battleships dominated the curriculum. Gunnery was the science that mattered. Surface engagements between battle lines of dreadnoughts were considered the decisive form of naval combat. Aircraft carriers were experimental platforms, interesting curiosities, but not the foundation of naval power. Most of McCluskey's instructors had never served on a carrier. Many doubted carriers would ever be more than reconnaissance platforms or convoy escorts. McCluskey graduated from Annapolis in 1926, ranked comfortably in the middle of his class. He was not the top graduate who would receive special recognition. He was not at the bottom, facing limited opportunities. He was solid, reliable, the kind of officer the Navy needed in large quantities to crew its expanding peacetime fleet. He served first on battleships and cruisers, learning traditional surface warfare. He qualified as officer of the deck, supervised gun crews, stood watches, did everything young officers did in the 1920s Navy. Then, aviation began to change everything. By the late 1920s, carriers were proving themselves in fleet exercises. The USS Lexington and Saratoga conducted mock raids that demonstrated carrier aircraft could strike targets hundreds of miles from the launch point. Forward-thinking officers began to recognize that carriers might represent a revolution in naval warfare equivalent to the introduction of steam power or armor plating. The Navy started actively recruiting officers to transition to aviation, and McCluskey volunteered. He reported to Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, for flight training in 1928. The training was rigorous and dangerous. Aviation in the late 1920s was still killing pilots regularly. Engine failures were common. Navigation over water was uncertain. Carrier landings were so hazardous that every approach carried real risk of death. But McCluskey proved to be a natural pilot with excellent spatial awareness and calm under pressure. He earned his wings in 1929 and received orders to Fighting Squadron 1, VF-1, flying fighters off the Lexington. The 1930s were formative years for carrier aviation, and McCluskey was there as the doctrine developed. He flew Curtiss F-6C biplanes, then Boeing F-4B fighters, learning how to operate aircraft from carrier decks in all weather conditions. He practiced dive bombing, which was emerging as the primary method for carrier aircraft to attack surface ships. He participated in fleet exercises where carriers simulated attacks on Pearl Harbor, the Panama Canal, and West Coast cities, demonstrating that carrier task forces could project power in ways battleships never could. By 1941, when war seemed inevitable, McCluskey had accumulated over a decade of carrier aviation experience. He understood the limitations of dive bombers, which were slow and vulnerable to fighters. He knew the challenges of coordinating multi-squadron strikes. He had practiced navigation over featureless ocean, where mistakes meant ditching in water and likely death. He was, by 1941 standards, a highly experienced carrier aviator, exactly the kind of officer the Navy needed in leadership positions. In April 1942, McCluskey received orders to command Air Group 6 aboard the USS Enterprise. The position made him responsible for all aircraft operations from the carrier, coordinating fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers in combat operations. He was a lieutenant commander, equivalent to a major in the Army or Marine Corps, commanding a mixed force of approximately 80 aircraft and several 100 aircrew and maintenance personnel. It was a position of immense responsibility, particularly since America was losing the war and Enterprise was one of only 3 carriers available to stop Japanese expansion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. McCluskey's first combat operations in command came in May 1942, when Enterprise participated in operations supporting the Battle of the Coral Sea. The carrier did not engage directly in that battle, arriving too late to participate in the main action, but McCluskey studied the after-action reports carefully. Those reports revealed troubling patterns. American torpedo squadrons were being decimated by Japanese fighters. Coordination between strike groups was poor. Many attacks failed because squadrons arrived at different times and were defeated piecemeal. The reports also showed something else that would prove crucial at Midway. Japanese carriers maneuvered unpredictably when under attack. They did not hold steady courses. They changed speed and direction to avoid bombs and torpedoes, which meant that navigation to intercept them was not simply a matter of plotting a course to where they should be. You had to anticipate where they would go and adjust accordingly. McCluskey spent the weeks between Coral Sea and Midway drilling his squadrons, improving coordination, emphasizing the importance of arriving together so that Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire would be overwhelmed. He studied Japanese carrier tactics, trying to understand how their commanders thought, how they would react to various threats. He was preparing for a battle he knew was coming, even if he did not know exactly when or where. The warning came in late May. Intelligence indicated a major Japanese operation was planned for early June, targeting Midway Atoll. Admiral Nimitz ordered Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown to take position northeast of Midway and wait for the Japanese to come within range. The carriers would launch strikes when the enemy was located, attempting to destroy the Japanese carriers before they could strike back. The plan was simple in concept, but extraordinarily difficult in execution. Everything depended on finding the enemy carriers and attacking them at exactly the right moment. On June 3rd, American patrol planes located Japanese ships approaching Midway from the west, but the initial contacts were transport ships and escort vessels, not the main carrier force. The carriers were still out there somewhere, probably north of Midway, but their exact position remained unknown. That night, McCluskey studied the intelligence reports and made his best estimate of where the Japanese carriers would be at dawn. He calculated courses, speeds, interception points. He knew the Japanese would attack Midway at first light, which meant they would be approximately 200 miles northwest of the atoll. That estimate would prove to be wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough that it would create the crisis McCluskey would have to solve with pure tactical judgment. At 04:15 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Enterprise began launching its strike force. McCluskey would lead 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, divided into two squadrons, Bombing 6 and Scouting 6. The Enterprise strike would be the largest American effort of the day, but it would not be alone. Hornet was launching its own strike force to the south. Yorktown would launch later after conducting morning patrol operations. If everything went according to plan, over 100 American aircraft would converge on the Japanese carriers simultaneously, overwhelming their defenses. McCluskey's SBDs took off in sequence, each aircraft carrying either a 1,000-pound bomb or a 500-pound bomb depending on squadron assignment. The total bomb load his squadrons carried represented enough explosive power to cripple or sink two carriers if the bombs found their targets. The aircraft climbed to altitude and formed up in the pre-dawn darkness, circling Enterprise while waiting for the torpedo squadron and fighter escort to launch and join them. This was where the plan began to unravel. The torpedo squadron was late getting airborne. The fighters were having difficulty finding the rendezvous point in the darkness. McCluskey circled for 30 minutes, burning precious fuel, waiting for the strike force to assemble. Finally, with dawn breaking and fuel consumption mounting, he made his first critical decision of the day. He would not wait any longer. His dive bombers would proceed to the target area without torpedo bomber or fighter escort. This violated doctrine. The entire concept of a coordinated strike depended on all elements arriving together. Torpedo bombers would attack low, drawing Japanese fighters down to sea level and forcing the carriers to maneuver. Fighters would engage enemy fighters, creating space for the dive bombers to attack from altitude. Dive bombers would then attack from above, dropping bombs on carriers that were already under pressure and unable to maneuver effectively. Without coordination, each element would arrive separately and be destroyed by Japanese fighters before inflicting meaningful damage. But McCluskey's fuel situation gave him no choice. If he continued circling, waiting for the other squadrons, his dive bombers would burn through their reserve fuel and might not have enough to return to Enterprise after attacking the enemy. He had to proceed now or abort the mission entirely. He turned his formation southwest and headed toward the intercept point where intelligence estimated the Japanese carriers would be. The flight out was uneventful. 33 dive bombers flying in formation at 14,000 feet, covering the distance at 110 knots, approximately 125 miles per hour. The pilots maintained radio silence. The sky was mostly clear with scattered clouds. Visibility was excellent. If the Japanese carriers were where they were supposed to be, McCluskey's squadrons would spot them from 30 miles away. At 09:20 hours, McCluskey's formation reached the expected intercept point. He looked down from 14,000 feet and saw nothing but empty ocean, no carriers, no task force, no smoke, no wakes. Just blue water extending to the horizon in every direction. The enemy was not where they were supposed to be. McCluskey had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine the outcome of the battle and possibly the war. Every pilot in his formation was watching their fuel gauges, doing mental calculations about how much longer they could search before they would not have enough fuel to return to Enterprise. Some aircraft were already at the point where ditching at sea was becoming more probable than making it home. The standard procedure in this situation was clear. Return to base. A failed search was disappointing but not catastrophic. The carriers would still be intact. Another strike could be organized with better intelligence. Sacrificing 33 dive bombers and 66 highly trained aircrew by continuing a futile search would be a strategic disaster that would cripple American offensive capability for months. But McCluskey understood something that doctrine did not account for. If he returned to Enterprise empty-handed, there would be no second chance. The Japanese carriers would complete arming their strike aircraft and launch against the American task force. They would find Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown exactly where American carriers were most vulnerable, with most of their aircraft landed for refueling and rearming. The Japanese strike would destroy all 3 American carriers before American forces could mount an effective defense. The battle would be over. The war in the Pacific would shift decisively in Japan's favor for years. The Japanese carriers had to be somewhere. They had attacked Midway at dawn. Patrol planes had reported that attack. The carriers launching that strike had to be within 200 miles of Midway. They could not have simply vanished. Something had changed. Some assumption in the intelligence estimate was wrong. McCluskey needed to determine what had changed and where that change would have taken the enemy carriers. He considered the possibilities methodically. Perhaps the Japanese were farther west than estimated, approaching Midway from a different angle. He had already flown southwest to the intercept point. Continuing southwest would take him farther from the expected position. Perhaps the Japanese were south of his position, closer to Midway than intelligence had predicted. That seemed plausible. Fast carriers making better speed than estimated could have closed the distance more quickly. But McCluskey rejected the southern hypothesis for a logical reason. Multiple PBY Catalina patrol aircraft from Midway were searching the waters south and west of the atoll. If the Japanese carriers were in that area, someone would have spotted them and reported their position. The radio had been silent except for reports of the dawn attack itself. Therefore, the carriers were probably not to the south, which left north. McCluskey made his decision. He would execute a box search pattern, turning north initially, then adjusting based on what his formation found. It was counterintuitive. Japanese carriers approaching to attack Midway should be south of his position, not north. But sometimes the counterintuitive answer was the correct one when conventional assumptions had already proven wrong. He keyed his radio and transmitted a brief order to his squadron commanders. The formation would turn north and continue searching for 15 minutes. If they found nothing after 15 minutes, they would turn back toward Enterprise and hope they had enough fuel remaining. Several pilots acknowledged the transmission. Nobody questioned the order, though every pilot understood what it meant. They would be flying away from their carrier for another 15 minutes, burning fuel they might desperately need for the return flight. The formation turned north and continued searching. The ocean below remained empty. Clouds drifted past. The sun climbed higher, reflecting off the water in brilliant patterns that made spotting ships even more difficult. 10 minutes passed, then 12. McCluskey was approaching the moment when he would have to order the turn back toward Enterprise. Some aircraft would probably have to ditch before reaching the carrier. Their crews would go into the water and hope rescue submarines could find them before they died of exposure or Japanese ships picked them up as prisoners. Then, at 0940 hours, 20 minutes after reaching the empty intercept point, McCluskey spotted something unusual. A single ship far below, making a white wake against the blue ocean, traveling northeast at high speed. The ship was not where any Japanese vessel should be. It was isolated, not part of the main task force. Through binoculars, McCluskey identified it as a destroyer, traveling alone at what appeared to be maximum speed, heading in a direction that made no tactical sense unless it was rejoining a larger force that had moved north. The destroyer was the Arashi. McCluskey did not know its name at the time, and he would never learn the specific reason it was separated from the main Japanese fleet. But he made an instant tactical judgment that proved absolutely correct. A destroyer running at full speed in the middle of the ocean was not conducting a random patrol. It was going somewhere important. Most likely, it was returning to its fleet after completing some mission that had delayed it. If McCluskey followed the destroyer's heading, it would lead him directly to the Japanese carriers. He ordered his formation to follow the Arashi's course, turning northeast to parallel the destroyer's heading. The white wake stretched ahead like an arrow pointing toward the enemy. McCluskey's formation followed that arrow. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Fuel gauges continued dropping toward empty. Several pilots reported they were below the level needed for safe return to Enterprise. McCluskey acknowledged the reports, but did not change course. They were committed now. Either they would find the Japanese carriers ahead, or they would ditch at sea. At 0:10:05 hours, 25 minutes after following the Arashi, McCluskey saw what he had been searching for. Ship wakes on the horizon, multiple vessels in formation, traveling northeast. As the range closed, the shapes resolved into 4 large carriers surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The entire Kido Butai, Japan's main carrier striking force, steaming directly below McCluskey's formation at 20,000 feet. The Japanese had no idea the American dive bombers were above them. Japanese radar technology in 1942 was primitive compared to what American and British forces were developing. The Kido Butai relied on visual observation from lookouts and patrol aircraft, but McCluskey's dive bombers had approached from an unexpected direction at an altitude where they were difficult to spot against the bright morning sky. The Japanese lookouts were scanning the horizon for surface ships and low-flying torpedo bombers, not for dive bombers at 14,000 feet coming from the northeast. More importantly, every Japanese fighter that should have been at altitude defending the carriers was at sea level. 3 separate American torpedo squadrons had attacked the Japanese carriers over the previous 40 minutes. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, all 15 aircraft shot down with only 1 survivor. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, 10 of 14 aircraft destroyed. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, 10 of 12 aircraft lost. 41 torpedo bombers had been sacrificed in suicidal low-level attacks that accomplished nothing except dragging every Japanese Zero fighter down to sea level to massacre them. The sacrifice of those torpedo squadrons, unintentional and tragic, had created the perfect conditions for McCluskey's dive bombers. The sky above the Japanese carriers was completely clear. No fighters, no combat air patrol. Nothing between McCluskey's 33 SBDs and the 4 carriers below, except 14,000 feet of air and 6 minutes of diving time. McCluskey assessed the situation rapidly. 4 carriers meant too many targets for his limited number of bombers. Standard doctrine would be to divide forces and attack multiple carriers simultaneously, but that would dilute the concentration of bombs and might result in damaging several carriers without sinking any. Better to concentrate overwhelming force against fewer targets, guaranteeing destruction of at least 2 carriers and accepting that the other 2 might escape. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He identified the 2 nearest carriers, Kaga and Akagi, and designated them as primary targets. He transmitted attack orders to his squadron commanders. Bombing 6 would attack Kaga. Scouting 6 would attack Akagi. 33 dive bombers carrying over 20,000 pounds of high explosives would focus on destroying 2 carriers. Then McCluskey rolled his SBD Dauntless into a 70-degree dive, and 32 aircraft followed him down. The dive bomber was designed specifically for this mission. Split dive brakes on the wings extended to control descent speed, allowing the pilot to maintain a stable dive angle while the bombardier aimed through a telescopic sight. The Wright R 1820 Cyclone engine produced 1,200 horsepower, enough to pull the aircraft out of its dive after bomb release before crashing into the ocean below. 2 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns in the engine cowling could suppress anti-aircraft fire during the final approach. The dive was violent and disorienting. Gravity pulled blood toward the feet, creating grey-out vision where everything faded to shades of grey. Wind noise from the dive brakes screamed at volumes that made communication impossible. The target grew larger in the bomb sight, from a small shape on the ocean to a massive carrier deck covered with aircraft. McCluskey could see Japanese flight deck crews moving around parked aircraft, completely unaware of the attack about to obliterate them. The cargo was a perfect target. The carrier's flight deck was packed with aircraft being armed and fueled for a strike against the American task force. Mechanics had wheeled bombs and torpedoes up from the magazines. Fuel hoses snaked across the deck, pumping aviation gasoline into aircraft tanks. The carrier had just completed recovering its Midway strike force and was preparing to launch an anti-shipping strike with every available aircraft. Another 15 minutes and those aircraft would have been airborne, heading toward Enterprise, but the cargo's crew had run out of time. McCluskey's bombardier released his 1,000-pound bomb at 2,000 feet. McCluskey pulled back on the control stick, fighting against gravitational forces that tried to crush him into his seat, hauling the SBD Dauntless out of its dive. The aircraft leveled off at 500 feet above the water, close enough that McCluskey could see Japanese sailors on the carrier's deck looking up at him. Behind McCluskey, 32 more dive bombers released their bombs in sequence, one after another, walking explosions up and down the carrier's flight deck. The bombs fell with terrible accuracy. Dive bombing was the most precise form of aerial attack available in Topa-Attack, 1942. Unlike high-altitude bombing, where bombs fell from 20,000 feet and could miss by hundreds of yards, dive bombing placed the aircraft directly above the target at release. Skilled pilots could put bombs within 20 feet of an aiming point. Several bombs hit the cargo directly. 1,000-pound warheads punched through the wooden flight deck and exploded inside the hangar deck, where more aircraft were being armed. The explosions triggered secondary detonations as bombs and torpedoes stored on the hangar deck cooked off. Aviation fuel ignited, creating firestorms that spread through the ship faster than damage control parties could respond. Within minutes, the cargo was burning from bow to stern. But there was confusion in the attack that would have significant historical consequences. Both Bombing 6 and Scouting 6, due to a radio communication error where multiple people transmitted simultaneously, attacked Kaga instead of splitting between Kaga and Akagi as ordered. 28 SBD Dauntlesses concentrated their bombs on a single carrier, achieving devastating overkill, while Akagi remained untouched. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding officer of Bombing 6, recognized the error as his squadron began their dives. He saw both squadrons converging on Kaga and realized Akagi would escape if nobody attacked it. He radioed his wingman and pulled out of formation with only 2 other aircraft following him. 3 SBD Dauntlesses against a fleet carrier was not standard doctrine. 3 bombers could not guarantee destruction of a capital ship. But Best had no choice. He rolled into his dive with his 2 wingmen and attacked Akagi alone. Best's bomb struck Akagi amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck where aircraft were being armed for launch. The bomb detonated among fuel lines and ordnance, creating a massive explosion that killed everyone in the hangar deck instantly. One of Best's wingmen scored a near miss that damaged the carrier's rudder, leaving Akagi unable to maneuver. The carrier immediately began burning out of control. Lieutenant Best's action, splitting off from his squadron to attack the unengaged carrier with only 2 wingmen, was the kind of tactical initiative that distinguished exceptional combat leaders from competent ones. He had recognized a developing problem, assessed it instantly, and acted decisively despite being outnumbered and outside established doctrine. His bomb effectively destroyed Akagi, even though it was only one direct hit. The carrier would burn for hours before being scuttled by Japanese escorts to prevent capture. While McCluskey's dive bombers were attacking Kaga and Akagi, another American strike force arrived over the Japanese fleet from a different direction. Yorktown's dive bombers, 17 SBD Dauntlesses commanded by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, had launched 30 minutes after Enterprise's strike. They had better navigation information and flew directly to the Japanese carriers without McCluskey's extended search. They arrived over the target at exactly the same moment as McCluskey's formations, purely by coincidence. Leslie's squadron attacked Soryu, the 3rd Japanese carrier, with devastating effect. Multiple bombs struck the carrier's flight deck and penetrated to the hangar deck. Like Kaga and Akagi, Soryu's hangar deck was packed with armed and fueled aircraft waiting to launch. The bombs created cascading explosions and fires that consumed the carrier within minutes. Soryu would burn for hours before sinking that evening. The entire attack, from the moment McCluskey rolled into his dive until the last bomb exploded, lasted approximately 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were transformed from operational warships into burning hulks. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was separated from the main formation and escaped immediate destruction. But 3 carriers burning simultaneously represented a catastrophic defeat for Japan. Half of the carrier force that attacked Pearl Harbor was destroyed. Hundreds of highly trained aircrew were dead or would die in the fires. Dozens of aircraft were destroyed. Years of training and operational experience were obliterated. As McCluskey pulled out of his dive and leveled off above the water, he faced his next crisis. 2 Japanese Zero fighters, the only enemy fighters who had managed to climb back to altitude after destroying the torpedo squadrons, were diving on his aircraft. Zeros were faster and more maneuverable than SBD Dauntlesses. A dive bomber fleeing at low altitude was an easy target for experienced fighter pilots. The Zeros attacked McCluskey's aircraft from behind, raking it with 7.7mm machine gun fire and 20mm cannon shells. 55 holes appeared in the fuselage and wings. 1 bullet struck McCluskey in the left shoulder, penetrating muscle but missing bone and major blood vessels. Another round shattered his left arm, breaking the radius and ulna. A 3rd bullet tore through his right leg, missing the femoral artery by less than an inch. McCluskey's rear gunner, Arm 1C Walter Chokolausek, returned fire with the aircraft's twin 50 caliber machine guns, shooting down one Zero and driving off the other. McCluskey remained conscious despite his wounds and blood loss. He kept both hands on the control stick, maintaining level flight, heading back toward Enterprise. The controls responded sluggishly because hydraulic lines had been severed and control cables were damaged. But the SBD Dauntless was famously rugged. It could absorb battle damage that would destroy lighter aircraft and continue flying. McCluskey coaxed his damaged bomber away from the burning Japanese carriers and turned southeast toward where Enterprise should be. The return flight became a test of endurance for every pilot who survived the attack. Fuel gauges showed levels well below what was considered safe for carrier recovery. Many pilots were wounded. Aircraft had damage from anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks. Navigation was uncertain because the carriers had moved since the launch, repositioning to avoid potential Japanese strikes. Pilots would have to find moving targets somewhere in thousands of square miles of ocean while flying aircraft that were running out of fuel. Several pilots ran out of fuel before reaching Enterprise. Their aircraft glided down to the ocean surface and ditched, the crews climbing into life rafts and hoping rescue submarines or patrol aircraft would find them before they died of exposure. 10 aircrew from McCluskey's formation were never recovered. Their aircraft ditched too far from friendly forces, or they were injured in the water landings and drowned before rescue arrived, or they simply disappeared in the vast Pacific. McCluskey reached Enterprise at approximately 1200 hours, 3 hours after launching. His aircraft had less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining when he landed. The flight deck crew immediately saw the blood and the battle damage. They helped McCluskey out of his cockpit and rushed him to the ship's medical bay where surgeons began treating his wounds. He had lost significant blood and had 3 bullet wounds requiring immediate surgery. But he was conscious and coherent, able to report to the ship's command that he had successfully attacked the Japanese carriers and that at least 2 were burning heavily. The medical staff removed the bullets from McCluskey's shoulder and leg. The arm wound required more extensive surgery to stabilize the broken bones. Surgeons spent 3 hours repairing damage before they were confident McCluskey would recover. He would spend the next several months in hospitals, undergoing additional surgeries and rehabilitation. His active flying career was effectively over. The injuries prevented him from returning to carrier operations, but McCluskey's contribution to the Battle of Midway was already complete. His decision to continue searching when the Japanese carriers were not where intelligence predicted them to be had enabled the attack that destroyed 3 enemy carriers. His judgment to follow the Arashi's course had led his formation directly to the target at the precise moment when Japanese fighter coverage was at sea level. His presence as air group commander had ensured the attack was coordinated and effective, despite the communication errors that sent too many aircraft against a single carrier. Admiral Chester Nimitz later assessed McCluskey's actions and concluded that his decisions on June 4, 1942, determined the outcome of the battle. Without McCluskey's extended search and his counterintuitive turn to the north, Enterprise's dive bombers would have returned to their carrier without finding the enemy. The Japanese would have launched their strike against the American task force with overwhelming superiority. The battle would have resulted in catastrophic American defeat. The war in the Pacific would have lasted years longer, with casualties mounting into the hundreds of thousands. The Battle of Midway continued after McCluskey's attack. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, launched strikes against Yorktown in the afternoon and succeeded in crippling the American carrier with bomb and torpedo hits. Yorktown would be abandoned and later sunk by a Japanese submarine. But American dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet located Hiryu that afternoon and attacked it with the same devastating effectiveness that had destroyed the other 3 Japanese carriers. By evening of June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or burning beyond salvage. The strategic implications were immediate and profound. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers that had been the core of its offensive power. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost the initiative in the Pacific and would never regain it. Japanese carrier construction programs could not replace the lost carriers for years. More critically, Japan lost experienced aircrew who could not be replaced at all. The pilots and maintenance personnel who died at Midway represented years of training that Japan's compressed wartime pilot training program could never duplicate. American forces, by contrast, retained 2 operational carriers after Midway and would soon receive new Essex-class carriers from American shipyards that were producing warships at rates Japan could not match. American pilot training programs were expanding rapidly, producing thousands of new aviators who would fly from those carriers. The industrial and demographic advantages that America possessed were beginning to manifest in ways that made Japanese victory increasingly impossible. McCluskey received the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway. The citation noted his extraordinary heroism, his tactical judgment under pressure, and his refusal to abandon the mission despite fuel concerns and incomplete intelligence. He was promoted to commander and later to captain. After recovering from his wounds, he commanded the escort carrier USS Corregidor in the latter part of the war, training pilots and conducting anti-submarine operations in the Atlantic. He retired from the Navy as a rear admiral in 1956. For the rest of his life, McCluskey rarely spoke publicly about Midway. He gave occasional interviews to historians researching the battle, but he deflected attention from himself and emphasized the contributions of other pilots, particularly Richard Best and the torpedo squadron crews, who sacrificed themselves attacking the Japanese carriers without fighter escort. When asked about his decision to continue searching when the carriers were not at the expected intercept point, McCluskey consistently described it as logical, tactical reasoning rather than intuition or luck. He explained that he knew Catalina patrol aircraft were searching south and west of Midway. If the carriers were in that area, someone would have reported them. Therefore, the carriers had to be north. Finding the Arashi was fortunate, but following the destroyer was standard procedure for locating a fleet. Any experienced naval officer would have made the same decision. McCluskey presented his actions as unremarkable application of professional judgment rather than exceptional heroism. But Admiral Nimitz assessed McCluskey's contribution differently. In his post-battle analysis, Nimitz stated unequivocally that McCluskey's decision to continue searching, his judgment about where the enemy must be, and his timing in arriving over the Japanese carriers at the precise moment when they were most vulnerable, collectively determined the outcome of the battle. Nimitz believed that without McCluskey's leadership, American forces would have lost at Midway, potentially extending the Pacific War by 3 additional years. The torpedo squadron pilots who attacked the Japanese carriers before McCluskey arrived also deserve recognition for their sacrifice. Those 41 aircraft and 82 aircrew flew into certain death, attacking heavily defended carriers with obsolete aircraft and unreliable torpedoes that frequently failed to detonate even when they hit targets. None of them expected to survive. They attacked anyway because doctrine required coordinated strikes and because their attacks might create opportunities for the dive bombers following behind them. Their sacrifice was not in vain. By forcing every Japanese Zero fighter down to sea level to destroy the torpedo bombers, they inadvertently created the defensive vacuum that allowed McCluskey's dive bombers to attack without opposition. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol was perfectly positioned to massacre slow-moving torpedo bombers at low altitude, but completely out of position to intercept dive bombers attacking from 14,000 feet. When McCluskey rolled into his attack dive, there were no Japanese fighters above 10,000 feet anywhere near the aft carriers. This combination of sacrifice and tactical judgment, of courage and professional competence, of tragedy and triumph, characterized the Battle of Midway and explained why it became the turning point of the Pacific War. The battle was not won by superior technology or overwhelming force. American forces were outnumbered and outgunned. Japanese pilots had more training and better aircraft in many respects. But American forces had codebreakers who provided strategic warning, commanders who positioned forces correctly, and tactical leaders like McCluskey who made the right decisions at the critical moments. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.